we've revealed today is a culture of a government that's very, very casual with the public's money. As we talk, businesses up and down the country are opening up. And we know those businesses will be very hard on the money that they spend as the cost of their operations, because they have to be. We would take that same approach, that same level of rigour, because you look at some of the things we've revealed. Did the government really need to spend that money on theatre training? Did they really need those pictures from the Tate Gallery?
Well, Parliamentary Under-Secretary for the Department for Transport, Richard Holden, defended the government, saying it has not been reckless.
What we've tried to do is introduce some real transparency into this sector. So in 2012, we publish on a monthly basis now all expenditure over £500 on the government procurement cards. That's all available for your viewers on the government's website on gov.uk. So that's what we're trying to do, greater transparency. That's why we've seen that massive fall since the last time Labour were in office on this, but we've always got to keep an eye on it.
The UK is reviewing its security after the United States shot down a fourth object spotted flying over North America in just over a week. Earlier this month, a suspected Chinese spy balloon was downed off the Carolina coast after it flew over sensitive military sites. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says it's another sign of how the global threat picture is changing for the worse. The US is yet to identify the latest object. During a Pentagon briefing, Air Force General Glenn Van Herk was asked if it could be alien.
I'll let the intel community and the counterintelligence community figure that out. I haven't ruled out anything at this point. We continue to assess every threat or potential threat unknown that approaches North America with the attempt to identify it.
The death toll has risen to almost 34,000 a week after the deadly earthquakes hit Turkey and Syria. Officials say the window for finding survivors is closing, but some people, including children, are still being pulled from the rubble alive. An appeal by the UK's Disasters Emergency Committee has raised more than £60 million. Two teenagers have been arrested on suspicion of murder following the fatal stabbing of a 16-year-old girl in Cheshire. Brianna Gay from Warrington was found with serious injuries on a path near Colchiffe Linear Park yesterday afternoon. Emergency services arrived, but she died at the scene. The UK's biggest airport has recorded the busiest start to its year since the pandemic. Heathrow's chief executive says it's back to its best after more than 5.4 million passengers travelled through the airport in January. The airport also says passenger satisfaction scores have exceeded the pre-pandemic levels. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Back now to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:35 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Parliament may well be in recess, but the politics does not stop. The Labour Party are hitting out at the government this morning over the use of its government procurement cards. 66,000 items of spending from 14 Whitehall departments. From five-star hotels for senior cabinet ministers to the rental of a hot pink photo booth for a Washington Embassy movie screening. Well, for its part, the government says that such spending is all signed off by senior officials and that the government procurement cards were actually introduced by the last Labour government in 1997. The Tories also note that Labour spent £996 million on the cards back in 2009 alone. Well, elsewhere this morning, rebellion is brewing in the House of Lords over the retained EU law bill. The government want to pass the bill cleanly, which will give ministers the power to ditch, amend or keep legacy EU laws. But some lords are pursuing specific amendments around rivers and lakes. And elsewhere, the Prime Minister finds himself once again at risk of presiding over a divided party, as prominent Brexiteers have raised questions over a private two-day summit in Oxfordshire, attended by some senior Conservatives, Labour MPs and business figures. The summit was entitled, "How Can We Make Brexit Work Better with Our Neighbours in Europe?" Well, The Observer has reported that many issues were discussed including the Northern Ireland Protocol, amendments to which are currently being negotiated. But first today, for decades, a grooming gang scandal has blighted this country, particularly across our northern towns. The shocking stories made national news headlines in the early 2010s, but the question remains, have we moved on without fully addressing many of these issues behind this scandal? Well, now a GBNews investigation has sought to restart a national conversation about this crisis and find out what went wrong then and what needs to change now. Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, a new documentary aired on Saturday night on GB News and is available in full on our GB News YouTube channel. But let's dive into its issues now. Alexander Stafford is the Conservative MP for the Rother Valley, who has consistently spoken up for the victims of these gangs and to end child sexual exploitation. Alex, thank you for joining us this morning. I suppose, first of all, why has this big scandal sort of drifted away from the front pages of our newspapers when it seems to still be going on?
Well, good morning there, Tom, and that's exactly right. Obviously, when it came to light in the mid-2010s, it was big news, everyone's talking about it. But I think that's the problem, everyone thinks it's gone away. And what is especially hard-hitting, as your GB News report said on Saturday night, is there's numerous Labour councillors in Rotherham who were part of the grouping that was told about CSE and did nothing, and yet they're still councillors sitting on Rotherham Council. And it almost seems like, one, the media attention has gone away, we can just continue as we were before. And it's great that GB News is actually shining a light on this abhorrent situation where these sitting councillors are still serving despite attending the various briefings warning them about CSE.
Now, of course, some of these councils have restructured. There have been a number of reports into what went wrong. Things are clearly slightly different now to what they were like in the early 2010s, but I suppose, in your view, not different enough.
Well, that's exactly right. What we're seeing from all the evidence is that the way children, girls are being groomed has definitely changed. In Rotherham, there was an issue around taxis. That seems to have been sorted out, but we're hearing that's now moved on to different parts, whether it's online, whether it's through petrol stations, above fast food outlets, we're hearing. But what's more worrying is the culture. The councillors who presided over this absolutely horrific situation where 1,500 girls in Rotherham were raped, some of them are still in position. And that, to me and to many people, is deeply concerning. The people who presided over the failure of the council who did cover up CSE, who did not acknowledge it was happening, are still in place and still in positions of power and authority. And that really sticks in the claw of many survivors. And actually, if you don't change the people involved, how can we ever have proper change to protect our girls going forward?
What is particularly shocking about so many of these cases is how many of the alleged perpetrators have got away with it, have not ended up going to prison, how victims have withdrawn complaints over fears for their own safety, how so much of this seems to operate extrajudicially. What needs to change in terms of getting these people that have been perpetrating these horrific evils behind bars?
Well, the main thing is making sure it is reported, and then when it is reported, that the police and all the relevant authorities, including the council, but social service and other aspects, take these complaints seriously. One of the big problems we had previously is when the victims came forward to say that they were being victims, the police, the council, not only didn't actually believe many of them, they often, in several situations, handed them back to the perpetrators and claimed that they were their boyfriends and other such ridiculous things. We clearly need to have a complete culture shift. That if people come forward to report a grooming, they need to be taken completely seriously, believed, and a thorough and full investigation. And what's more, we should definitely have a complete, serious look at the historic crimes to make sure those people who did commit those crimes are put behind bars, because there should never be a time where people who committed such horrific actions ever think it's safe for them to go outside and safe for them to be in free society, because they shouldn't. They should be in jail.
To what extent was the issue here the fact that these gangs are predominantly Pakistani Muslim men operating these gangs, and white councillors being, or white police officers, or all the rest of it, being afraid of being called racist if they were to investigate such gangs?
Well, that's exactly right. And the J and the KC reports into what happened in Rotherham made it perfectly clear that the reason why many of the girls were not believed was because they were worried, and I quote, upset racial sensitivities. I don't care whether one is Asian extraction, white extraction, a paedophile is a paedophile, a rapist is a rapist. It doesn't make a jot of difference, their backgrounds. They should all be investigated and should all be put in bars. And we should never get to a situation where, frankly, people's feelings come before those of girls who have been raped. There is no equivalence. And I don't care who does the crime as long as they're investigated. And no authority should ever shy away from protecting our young girls and young boys from these horrific activities for some bizarre belief they might be accused of being racist.
Now, I know you've been campaigning on this for a long time. It's an issue close to your heart. What are the next steps that the government needs to take in order to make sure that this scandal is actually put in the past where it belongs?
Well, there's two things that I really want the government to do. One of them is to have a child criminal and sexual exploitation commissioner to work with the child commissioner to make sure those children who are seen previously as committed crimes because they're forced to due to the grooming gang's nature are looked into and have that record expunged. But another thing which I'm very serious about is anybody who's held any form of authority during a situation such as in Rotherham where there's such widespread horrific paedophile abuse should not be allowed to hold any form of public office ever again. We've heard again and again that previous councillors who got jobs back in the NHS who are still sitting councillors who are involved in or covered up or denied existence, and there should be no place for people who are not taking CSE seriously, and we need to change the law to ensure that happens.
It's a strong case. Alex Stafford, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really, really interesting stories that we must not forget. Conservative MP for Rother Valley, of course. Now, we must include a statement from the Labour Party in all of this. The Labour Party says that they take the findings of the J and Casey reports incredibly seriously. The NEC took necessary action at the time against officials implicated. That's a statement from a Labour Party spokesman. Now, moving on to something else the Labour Party has been talking about today. The Labour Party has condemned what it describes as luxury spending on government credit cards. Minister Richard Holden told GBNews this morning that the government was being transparent with its spending.
We're going to see this in the broader context. So it's around £150 million last year. But actually, back in 2009, 2010, when Labour were last in, this was almost £1,000 million. So it's 85% lower. What we've tried to do is introduce some real transparency into this sector. So in 2012, we publish on a monthly basis now all expenditure over £500 on the government procurement cards. That's all available for your viewers on the government's website on gov.uk. So that's what we're trying to do, greater transparency. That's why we've seen that massive fall since the last time Labour were in office on this, but we've always got to keep an eye on it.
So there we have it, the government's words on government procurement cards. But this has been a bit of a tit for tat. The government saying that Labour spent a lot on them, the Labour Party saying that the Conservatives spent a lot on them. Is this a debate that actually does our politics any good? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by John Ashmore, the editor of Cap X, the excellent online news website. And John, I suppose, first of all, is it any surprise that the Labour Party is going after government procurement cards? Some of these items sound pretty silly, whether it was that pink photo booth for a Washington, D.C. embassy party, or indeed some of the art that has been installed in government offices. Surely some of this is excessive.
Yeah, I mean, as you said before, there's sort of tens of thousands of items of spending that are detailed here, and some of them are pretty daft, as you say, the photo booth, various bits of spending on kind of cake for team building events and things like this that seem a bit excessive when you look at it. But I think the overall story here is a complete horlicks, really. I mean, Labour have put out this press release saying that spending on these cards has gone up by 70%. But if you actually look at the report they've put out, the so-called GPC files, which makes it sound like Watergate or something, they've got some massive caveats. They haven't included the Ministry of Defence, which accounted for 3/4 of GPC spending the last time they looked at this in 2012. So they just haven't included that department, apparently because of anomalies in the data. They also say that some of the figures for 2022 may include VAT, so another 20% on top of the 2012 figures, which didn't include VAT. And then the mother of all caveats, which is that COVID and inflation have massively increased the spend on these cards. So once you actually factor all of that in, it really isn't the kind of scandal that they'll have us believe. And it certainly isn't. I think Emily Thornberry, Shadow Attorney General, used the phrase the last days of Rome to describe this. I mean, it's ridiculous. They also seem to be implying that ministers themselves have been, spending all this money on our behalf on lavish hotels and stuff. Does anyone seriously think that Rishi Sunak books his own hotels for international conferences and stuff like that? I think, as you said, there are some silly items of spending here. We should obviously be as tight as possible when we're spending taxpayers' money. But the overall impression Labour are trying to create here is completely false, in my opinion.
It is interesting that under pressure this morning, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, admitted that the Labour Party would still, in some circumstances, hire out five-star hotels for senior figures. And I suppose it only makes sense. If a Prime Minister is going to an international summit, you don't really want them to slum it in some sort of budget drive-through motel.
No, I mean, I enjoy the Travelodge buffet as much as the next man, but I think there are very obvious security reasons as well why senior ministers need to stay in certain types of establishments. There's also, we talk about travel quite a lot, about the PM taking planes instead of trains and things like that. Again, that is partly a security consideration. It's just not possible to work in the way they want to on a train that's going to take 4 or 5 hours. If they can get from A to B more quickly, it's actually a more productive use of their time, and ultimately, I would say probably offers more value to the taxpayer than having people scuttling around unable to work for hours and hours and hours of their working day. So again, I think with all this stuff, it's always worth going beyond the headline figure and looking at what it's actually telling you. The other point is we're only talking about a certain type of spending here. This is spending on a particular kind of credit card, the government procurement card. It's not about overall spending by the department. So it'd be much more interesting to gauge how that has evolved over the last 10 years, rather than just saying, oh, they're spending more on this particular type of spending. It doesn't really tell us that much.
It's interesting, however, to look at sort of how opposition parties always access this sort of information and make political points of it. There was a request of there was a ministerial question, I believe, from Stuart Jackson, the former MP for Peterborough, back in 2010. We can show on our screens now. This was asking the minister how much had been spent on these cards. £996 million just in 2009 spent on these cards by the last Labour government. I suppose it is sort of the same. Every sort of government will do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think this was particularly after the expenses scandal, it became very popular to claim that particularly civil servants were kind of indulging themselves on, or council credit cards was another great one back in about sort of 10, 11 years ago. And yeah, as you say, I mean, governments will take pot shots at each other. My concern is that I think this could lead to some fairly silly decision-making processes in the future. If people are terrified that every item of spending is going to be kind of scrutinised in this way, as if it's potentially a frippery or a waste of public money, they might delay or indeed not spend money on things that actually are necessary just because they're worried about potential press coverage in the future. So as I said to you before, I think it's perfectly good, reasonable to scrutinise spending. Worth saying as well, I mean, as Richard Holden said in that clip, the government introduced these rules themselves for allowing having more transparency about items that were worth £500 or more. So I mean, the idea that they're trying to kind of hide anything, I think, is slightly ridiculous. Only one final thing I'd say, Tom, is that there are lots of kind of reporting cock-ups in this report, which I think the government does need to sort out. There needs to be a lot more uniformity. It shouldn't take parliamentary questions for department to be able to find out what departments are spending. So I think that they do have a point there, and they do have a point on some of these items of spending. But overall, the idea that this is some kind of lavish culture, I think, is nonsense.
No, at the end of the day, transparency really, really does matter, and it is fascinating to look at sort of what sort of establishments ministers have been staying in, even though I suppose it's not going to affect the budget deficit to any great degree, whether a minister stays in a 4- or a 5-star hotel. What really will affect a budget deficit is whether or not we have a targeted rather than a universal energy subsidy, for example. I noticed the Labour Party is not really talking about that sort of potentially hundreds of billions of pounds that are being spent, but perhaps that's a conversation for another day. John Ashmore, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate your time. And now, finally, today, we're going to look at something a little bit different. We mentioned that private cross-party summit on Brexit at the top of the programme. Well, one of those issues discussed there by figures including Michael Gove and David Lammy was the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has prevented a functioning government forming in Northern Ireland for over a year. Well, turning our sights to Northern Ireland, the Assembly could meet in Stormont as early as tomorrow to elect a new Speaker in order to pass crucial opt-out organ donation laws. Well, GBNews Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie joins me now live from Stormont to make sense of it all. So, still no executive formed in Northern Ireland, but potentially the Assembly meeting tomorrow.
Yes, and it is really a bit of political theatre, to be honest. They're trying to put through a new law called Daithí's Law. Now, Daithí is a very brave young man. He comes from a great family. They've tried through many years here to change the transplant and organ donation laws. Anywhere in other parts of the UK, you have to opt out. In Northern Ireland, we still have this process where you have to have permission and opt in, if you like, in order to have your organs donated. And it has had massive cross-party support here in Northern Ireland, but it fell short of the time limit of when the legislation could actually go through the House here, because of course this behind me collapsed due to the protocol. Now, there is history on this, because of course Westminster is sovereign here, and in the past the abortion and same-sex marriage bills both passed through Westminster when Sinn Féin stayed out of here for 3 years in 2016-17 period. So Chris Heaton-Harris could well do exactly the same thing, and he knows he has the cover of the political parties here. Nobody objected to it. He could well just go to Westminster and do what Julian Smith done and pass it through the House of Commons and become law. But he's trying to push the DUP and Unionists back into government behind us here. Now, it is interesting last week, of course, that he extended the deadline for elections. You remember we had elections here and there was a government came in October, but no government, of course, sat because they have to have cross-party support. He extended that for a year now as opposed to months at a time, and that's because the DUP and Unionists are starting to gather momentum in the polls, because people are really feeling the effects of the protocol in Northern Ireland.
Really interesting stuff. Potentially some sort of agreement inching closer between the UK and the EU. We'll keep our eyes very closely on that as the days and months go on. But Dougie Beattie, for now, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. That's all we've got time for today on the show, so thanks for joining me. Catch me again tomorrow at 9:30. But up next, it's Bev Turner Today.
Good morning, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office. It'll be quite a cloudy start to the new week, but we can expect some sunny spells later. And this settled weather has been due to high pressure that's been across the UK for quite some time now. It's going to be sticking around into this week, but we might just start to see some weather fronts pushing in from the west later on. Back to this morning, and it's quite a cloudy start out there with maybe some mist and fog patches around too. Though as they lift and break and the cloud elsewhere will lift too, we'll see some sunny spells developing throughout the morning and into the early part of the afternoon today. Temperatures will be doing well once again for the time of year, with highs of around 10 to 12 across southern areas. through the rest of this afternoon and into this evening with clear spells around. It'll be a touch cooler in some places tonight with a risk of mist and fog, particularly across East Anglia and South East England tonight. Though looking further west, and some cloud is starting to spill its way in as we head into Tuesday morning, bringing some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle too. But this will keep temperatures up in the west, though a cooler night to come in the east, with a chance of some patchy rural frost. Now, as we look through to the start of tomorrow, and we'll start to see that cloud spilling its way north and eastwards through the morning, bringing some outbreaks of rain and drizzle, particularly across Scotland, Northern England and Northern Ireland. Elsewhere, it'll be a dry and bright day with plenty of sunshine, and temperatures will be doing once again very well for the time of year, with highs of even 13 across England and Wales tomorrow. And the weather isn't set to change too much as we head throughout the rest of the week, but by around midweek we might just see some outbreaks of rain, and temperatures will be remaining at or just above average for the time of year.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons. I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Very good morning. Welcome to Bev Turner today on GB News. After 300 freedom of information requests and a huge amount of research, the Labour Party have produced a document claiming that the Conservatives are overseeing a culture of financial waste, spending £145 million on expenses in 2021. Unsurprisingly, the Conservatives have branded Labour's analysis a political stunt. I'm tempted to agree with them. And also, we're going to dig into all of that. But also, what are these mystery objects that keep being shot out of the sky? Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said the UK should conduct a security